When I was first starting out with surgeries, I got really good at dealing with deep lacerations and any sort of suturing work. And of course, the other doctors at the hospital noticed this, so I started getting all of the good cases. And, well, when I say good, I mean difficult, heavily involved, and most often very tragic. I've seen some crazy trauma. Now, on a Valentine's Day, just before midnight, a man entered the ER and collapsed on the floor with blood pooling around him. Of course, the staff moved quickly and moved him to a room where they started to stabilize him. We discovered that the laceration was from his left shoulder to his left hip. When I started inspecting the man, I noticed the cut was far deeper up at his shoulder and grew thinner towards the bottom. Now, me and the team got him all cleaned up and stitched back together. Whatever had caused the cut didn't cut into anything vital or cause too much damage. I mean, it was a nasty cut though. The man panicked for a moment when he woke up, because he didn't know where he was. But he eventually calmed down and thanked us for taking care of him. We asked him for an explanation, and he went on to tell us that he had been part of a cult, and they tricked him into being the sacrifice to please some sort of god. When I asked him which god, he wouldn't explain any further, and he wouldn't talk to the police when they questioned him. And we kept him for the next few days, obviously for the cut and, well, the mental state of mind. The man glanced out of the windows all the time, as if someone was coming after him, and kept telling me that he was going to leave town when he was given the okay to leave. I advised him for a follow-up visit about 2 weeks later as usual, but when the man checked out, he never returned. Before I started working in a big hospital in Seattle, I worked at an urgent care in a smaller town in the middle of the state. It wasn't the most prestigious job in the medical industry, but you still get to help people, and occasionally there were more over-the-top cases, even though most of those got sent over to the hospitals after our initial examinations. Once, I'd been told that the next patient that I was going to see had a bite mark and some minor burns. I thought it was a strange combination of injuries, but I entered the room with a smile and proceeded through the usual questions. Everything was healthy and fine with the man, but when I asked him to show me the injury, he lifted his leg and showed me a bite mark which resembled a small alligator bite, and the burns were right around the puncture marks in the leg. The burns weren't bad enough to send him to the emergency room, and the punctures weren't deep enough that we couldn't stitch them up ourselves, although I think I actually glued them. But it doesn't matter. When I asked the man what he'd received the bite mark from, he told me that he had a huge lizard chained in his basement. I remember keeping a straight face, but the nurse let out a little chuckle. When pressed a little further, he still claimed that it was from the lizard, and even went as far as to demonstrate how the thing bit him, and then scorched him. I decided it best to give him a rabies shot, just because whatever we looked at was some sort of wild animal. He did eventually come around, saying that he did keep a giant lizard in his basement. It did bite him, but he burnt the wounds himself to try to close them up. I didn't like working in the hospital. It just didn't seem to be quite the right fit for me. So I took my boss's advice and switched to being a paramedic riding in an ambulance. It was a lot of training. It was different from what I was doing, but I tell you what, I love the change and I still love my job. However, I'd like to say that I recently had a bizarre experience with a patient. On a rainy autumn night with a bitter breeze in the air, we received a call that a woman had suffered a heart attack at one of the dance clubs downtown. A very common call. We got there and checked her. She did show signs of a heart attack, but She was stable, so we eased the woman onto a gurney and then started taking her into the ambulance. I asked her for her name, and she had me leaning closer and told me that she was being followed. Now, I instinctually glanced around, but every single person watched us with drunken stares as we put her into the back of the vehicle. I waited to ask her any further questions until the doors were closed. She leaned towards me and asked us if he'd followed, and I peered out the small window in the back door. Of course, there were several people looking in. I told her no, and the ambulance pulled away from the curb. As I went through the protocol of patients who'd suffered cardiac arrest, she told me that the stalker was everywhere. He was never far away, and if she looked hard enough, she could see him. I tried to assure her that she was safe, but she told me to look out the window and look for him. Now, look out the window, it didn't show me much, but I did notice a man with a blue beanie glance up at the ambulance as we drove by. I attempted to get her off the subject, so she was thinking about something else. I started to assume that she might be on drugs, which could have caused the heart attack, but she seemed mostly normal and not even drunk. She went on to tell me that the reason she believed she had a heart attack was from fear, because she'd been running from her stalker and trying to hide for days. Of course, a friend suggested for her to stay in busy areas, hence the club, which is where he had approached her and had scared her nearly to death. I tried once again to assure her that she was safe. She still claimed no, and asked me to look out the window for him yet again. Now at that point, my thoughts turned to her potential mental illness, but then I did look out the window, and once again, the man in the blue beanie looked back at me, a face amongst the walkers under umbrellas. I was amazed because we'd been moving fast, so for the man to keep up, he needed some sort of vehicle. Now, I convinced myself that it hadn't been the same person, just an odd coincidence. As we neared the hospital, the patient leaned near me again. She said, "I don't think he's human. He moves too fast and sometimes hides in places you wouldn't think someone could fit." A chill ran down my spine and the gurney was pulled out of the ambulance. We ran her into the emergency room, and the doctors took over, rushing her off into some far-off room. When I turned to go back to the ambulance, I saw him again, sitting amongst the patients in the waiting room. I immediately told security that the patient had a stalker, and that she needed a guard nearby. He nodded, and I left the hospital. I don't know what to think of the stalker, but when I asked about the patient, I was told that she left with her family. I pulled the bus up to the house where we were told to go. The call said it was a man in his 60s who'd collapsed and hit his head. I remember the house being filthy on the outside. It had once been white, but at some point in time it turned to gray. Front yard was a mess with trash lying about and untamed grass and shrubs. There was a young woman waiting to meet us on the sidewalk, and she told us that she was the daughter of the man living in the house. She was visiting him for the first time in months when this happened. She apologized beforehand, before we walked into the house, and the smell hit me like I was running into a wall. It was urine and feces. The walls were dirty, the floor is soggy, and trash and stuff just filled all corners of the house. It was clear that this was a hoarder's house. We found the man who was sitting in a chair watching us as we eyed all of his things. Several cats scurried through the clusters of junk. I took a look at the man and looked him over. He appeared to be completely okay except a small cut and no concussion. But I noticed something in the corner of the man's kitchen while I was checking the back of his head. A dead cat, half decomposed, flies and maggots. I held myself back from puking, and the other paramedic and I started to leave the building. I tripped over something. I'm not sure if it was the cat running by or one of the various pieces of trash in the house. It wasn't the lightest in there, and I could hardly see what was really on the floor. The older man asked me if I was okay, and if I needed a hand. I told him I was okay as I was pushing myself up from the wet, rotting carpet. I stopped halfway up as I noticed a cage tucked between the trash. The movement came from inside that cage, and at first, I thought it was just another cat inside it, but it shifted enough that I could get a better look at it. Now it seemed to be, well, a monkey, I guess, but it was completely hairless. Not like it had been shaved, but like it was an animal that didn't grow hair. Now, for a moment, the idea of it being a child in a cage crossed my mind, but it definitely was not human. It wasn't human, though, it was something close. Like a close relative to the human on the evolutionary tree. Now, behind me, the man stared at me with wide eyes and glanced between me and the cage. I continued to stand and told the man and his daughters to have a nice day. The man's eyes remained wide. When I reached the ambulance, I got in and grabbed my phone, then dialed for a policeman to arrive, claiming that the owner was an animal hoarder and was hoarding an exotic animal. And of course, there was a little time that we would have to wait, so we stayed until the patrolwoman arrived. I gave her my details of everything going on and what we had seen inside, and that the man refused to go in the ambulance even though he hit his head and whatnot. And she said that this wasn't the first hoarder in this exact neighborhood she had to deal with. The man and his daughter didn't answer her knocks. She came back saying that there wasn't anything further that she could do without a warrant or probable cause. She came back saying that there wasn't anything further that she could do without a warrant. And, that the neighbors hadn't made any complaints of the house. But that she would get in contact with the people that deal with animal cases. Now, several months had passed, and I didn't hear anything of the house. Actually, I tried to forget about the strange creature in the cage. But then I picked up the same man from a restaurant after he suffered a heart attack. And after the man woke up, he told me that all of his cats had been seized, and that he was forced to clean up his house. When I asked him about the animal in the cage, he told me that it was one of the ones that he made. For a while, I rode as a paramedic with the local fire department. I had a good time doing it. And there was one incident which kind of gave me the chills, and it still does to this day when I think about it. It was a freezing cold January night, and this was Montana, so it got incredibly cold. We didn't usually get much, but we got a call that someone heard some shouting for help from the forest near their home. So we suited up, making sure that we dressed warm enough for the negative temperatures. When we arrived, we could hear it. It was a man calling out for help. It was obvious, but it wasn't very loud. We moved fast, knowing that someone stuck in these temperatures faced life-threatening situations. Our lights scanned in all directions, but we couldn't see anyone and any signs of people near us. So we fanned out a little, and that way we could hopefully find the person. But his shouts became quieter and less frequent, and I stopped when I heard it again. But this time, I knew it came from directly above me. I shined my light up to see a man wrapped in one of the treetops, and it appeared that the rope held the man against the tree. We placed the ladder against the tree and cut the man down. He was obviously incredibly thankful, saying that we had saved him just in time. We weren't sure what he was talking about, because all of his vitals were reading fine, so we asked him to elaborate. He told us that they were like people, but they weren't. In the shadows, their eyes looked more like that of a cat's, and that they had more than 2 arms. They kept telling the man that they were going to eat him, and that if he screamed, they'd cause him pain before eating him. Now, The police opened an investigation to find who had tortured the man, but nothing ever came of it. And as it turned out, the man had taken a bit of mind-altering drugs, and there were a ton of stray cats in the area. Those fires back in the day were nothing like the ones we just experienced. They were the true test of my abilities as a doctor. I've been called to the area to help with the overflow of people from the evacuated areas. Now, everything seemed pretty normal at first. Only a few people coming in to be seen for inhaling too much smoke or those with a few burns. But after a few days in, and the fire increased in rage, the numbers increased as well. The smoke and burns on people seemed to be getting worse each day. And many of the people I worked with were growing frustrated because most of the citizens in the area should have been evacuated. The firemen argued that the fire seemed incredibly unruly, shifting in ways they didn't know it could, even against the wind. Now, I felt sympathetic for both sides, since we were all being overworked, and this was turning out to be the worst fire in decades. I had 2 young teenage boys come into the clinic together with severe burns and completely dehydrated. They told me that they had been hiking through the hills so that they could get a glimpse of the fire, but they saw something more than they wanted to. They started talking about seeing figures in black robes and hoods, that they stood in a circle, and that there was a strange circle drawn in the dirt in the middle of their circle. Now, I considered testing them for drugs, but decided against it and just went along with their story. I've heard a lot. I've seen a lot over the years as a doctor. And they continued to tell me that as the robed figures spoke in different languages, the flames began to rage harder on the adjacent hill. The boys said that the figures saw them, and they ran. Somehow, the fire had jumped to their hill and cut down across their path. I told one other person at the clinic, and he told me that they're probably just kids on acid or some sort of mind-altering drug, and that they're just trying to come up with some lucrative stories so that they don't get in trouble. It made sense to me, but it seemed like an odd type of story to use as a cover-up. Last week, I was woken in the middle of the night so that I could come into the hospital and see a patient who had requested me personally. Now, reluctantly, I put myself together and went to the hospital. It was an older patient that had been coming to see me for a few years. She appeared frightened, and she told me she'd been attacked. So I told the nurse to get a hold of the authorities, but she refused it. She wouldn't tell me why at first, but she did show me the bite mark on her arm. It was fresh, so we cleaned her up and I asked her what had happened. I could tell by the teeth marks that it was indeed a human that bit her. As we were putting a few stitches in the deeper puncture marks, I continued to press her to spill the beans on what had happened to her. Even told her that I would keep it a secret. Told her about doctor-patient confidentiality. I was surprised that she wouldn't tell me, because I assumed that she felt pretty comfortable with me over the past few years. But before she left the room and I cleared her, she leaned closer to me and whispered, "My husband did it." Now, I was confused, as I thought her husband had been deceased for a decade or so. And when I asked, she replied with, "He's been dead for a while, but I keep him locked in the basement." After she left, I sent the authorities to her address that we had at the hospital. They returned, claiming it wasn't the right one. I always enjoyed surgeries that were unconventional and a little more challenging. So I was always handed the unusual patients. On a cold November evening, a patient came in complaining about abdominal pain. They started checking the patient, palpating the area, temperature, blood pressure, etc., etc., etc. But when they took an x-ray, everything came to a stop, because it showed that the man had an incredibly abnormal anatomy. so they called me in to help with the case. Now, I'd worked with patients with abnormalities before, but this man's anatomy stopped me in my tracks when I looked on his x-ray. The sense of urgency crept into me as the patient complained to me about the pain getting exponentially worse. It was hard to converse with the man as he was so focused on the pain, so I ordered the man some morphine, and while I waited for his pain to subside, I searched through the patient's medical history, find that there wasn't ever a reference on this abnormality. After I let the painkiller work, which didn't take long in a drip, I went back to him and asked him if he had any abnormal medical conditions. I didn't used to, the man claimed to me. Then he must have seen the confusion on my face, because he further explained, I was abducted, and they moved them. They moved my organs. Now, as I further questioned him, he elaborated that he'd been drugged and taken by someone. He was adamant that someone had done this to him. I didn't argue, but I also didn't believe him, so I picked up his records again. No sign of alcoholism, drug use, or mental illness. Not even in his family, which was rare. I pushed his theory aside and went back to his x-rays. After examining for a while, I noticed the problem. His liver had tiny little things attached to it. And this is when I noticed the minuscule sutures. Someone had done this to him, and I was actually surprised that he was still alive. I wrote up a plan, and when I discussed it with the patient, he wanted the surgery. I enlisted the help of another surgeon that was at the hospital with me, and after hours of surgery, we reconstructed the man enough for his organ to work properly. We never really found out what happened to the man, but I still keep the x-rays. Or maybe he had been abducted and somebody tried to take his organs.